Hello, everyone. Welcome to our traditional ecological knowledge seminar. This is our first invited speaker, and our first speaker is Dr. Henry Huntington. And I'll keep his bio short as he requested. But Dr. Huntington earned his bachelor's degree in English at Princeton University, his master's and doctorate in polar studies at the University of Cambridge. He is the owner of Huntington Consulting in Eagle River, Alaska, and also the Arctic Science Director for Ocean Conservancy. Huntington's research interests include the regulations of subsistence hunting in northern Alaska, traditional ecological knowledge of beluga whales and bowhead whales, Iñupiat and Inuit knowledge and use of sea ice, and assessing the impacts of climate change on Arctic communities and Arctic marine mammals. And I'll end there with the introduction and let Henry take it away. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Ty and Roll, and thank you all for coming and the chance to speak. You've seen the title that was distributed was the Academic Engagement with Indigenous Knowledge, and on the screen you'll see I've added a few more words there just to liven things up a little bit. I'm not Indigenous. I grew up in suburban Boston in Massachusetts, and I'll tell you a little bit about how I got to Alaska in a moment. And I'll try to remember to explain at least some of the pictures that we see so you know what you're looking at. Here we have on the left the late Iñupiat elder Warren Matumiak talking with Andy Mahoney, a sea ice scientist from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And they're looking at satellite imagery of sea ice and discussing what each of them sees and having a very high level conversation between two real sea ice experts who come at it from a very different perspective. To me, this is kind of the heart of what we're talking about is making that connection and finding ways to learn with one another. I think from looking at the list, you'll have other speakers who will talk about traditional knowledge from the Indigenous and community point of view, which is terrific. I will try not to pretend that that's my point of view, but talk about it as an outsider coming in and trying to engage with Arctic communities. So I thought I'd just give a quick background on how I got here, because I certainly didn't set out to be working in the field of traditional knowledge or Indigenous knowledge. Didn't set out to do that from an early age or anything. Actually went the other direction. In high school, I got fascinated by the Antarctic exploration and reading some of the early explorers' accounts and so on. And senior year of high school, somehow got cold feet about the idea of college and ran away and got a job as a janitor at McMurdo Station in the Antarctic. And got fascinated by things Antarctic, which was terrific. Went to college, as Ty mentioned, majored in English more or less by default because I wasn't quite sure where I wanted to go with things, but then found out that there was a program in polar studies, and that sounded terrific. And I thought, well, I should go see the Arctic. It's a polar studies program, not just Antarctic things. I'll go spend a little time in the Arctic, and then I'll maybe turn back to Antarctic affairs. After college, I found myself off the north coast of Alaska counting bowhead whales, and it's a fascinating, interesting job to be standing out on the edge of the ice with a pair of binoculars and looking out at the water, but also seeing not just all the fun ice and snow and stuff that attracted me to the Antarctic, but also the fact that you had native cultures and real communities, not just transient research bases. So learning more about the people and the culture opened my eyes quite a bit, and got me really interested in learning more. So I wound up doing my graduate work on Arctic things instead of Antarctic. Then after that, went and worked for an organization called the Alaska Eskimo Whaling Commission, representing the rights and interests of Iñupiaq and Yupik whalers in northern and western Alaska, and went around to all the small whaling villages. There were 9 at the time, and now there are 11, and took a map along with me. And at the end of the meeting, I'd put the map out on the table, and people would quickly gather around and start eagerly pointing out local features and place names and what was happening with the ice and the whales and more. And it was just fascinating to me that the amount of energy that they had for that at the end of a meeting, and the depth of the knowledge that they had. And I thought, well, this is really cool. Has anybody ever written this down? And the answer was, well, not really. And I thought, well, cool, that's something we ought to do. That was kind of my start, my introduction to the concept of traditional knowledge and what could be done. And since then, I've gone in a few different directions, but a bunch of projects looking at different aspects of traditional knowledge, which I'll talk about in a sec. All of which is to say that my career path has probably looked more like these meandering ptarmigan tracks. The ptarmigan's a small grouse-like bird that the state bird of Alaska. Here they are wandering around in the snow in a little willows in the wintertime. It'd be nice to say, oh, well, I had a clear path and I've been relentlessly pursuing it in a single direction. There probably are people like that. I'm not one of them. My guess is that a lot more people, truth comes to it, probably, their path may be a bit more meandering like this, and going around as interesting things come up, and as we learn new things and find something else to attract our attention for a while. So anyway, enough of that. Let's get on with the lecture. So I think Ty covered some of this last week of what we're talking about with traditional knowledge. Many different names depending on who you talk to, where you are, exactly what you're trying to say. There are, I think, some important differences in terminology, but at heart, we're all talking about more or less the same thing, which is a system of experiential knowledge people have picked up by observation. They've transmitted, shared with one another. And it can come in many ways. You often hear people talk about, say, the spiritual side of things, or experiences that people have had, or journeys that shamans have made, taking the form of an animal and learning things. All of these are ways that contribute to people's understanding of their environment. And I think it's important to take that the way they see it, rather than to come in and say, well, I only want to hear about things that you saw when you were wide awake and not in a trance, but instead to say, okay, how do you understand the environment, and how does that inform what you do and how you do it? So again, acquisition is by experience typically, and then transmission often by example and by stories. It's great that there's a class on traditional ecological knowledge, but of course that's not the common mode of transmitting that knowledge within the community where it's generated and held. I've heard people say, oh, no one ever taught me, I just followed my dad and my uncles. Well, okay, that's a different style of teaching, perhaps. They weren't standing up and giving a talk in a classroom, but you were out watching them. They were doing things and sort of leading or teaching by example. And we often hear stories too that capture important features of the environment or our experience with it. And that's a powerful way of memorable way of transmitting information as well. So from an academic point of view, why pay attention? What I meant to be telling you about the pictures. So this is a few Inuit in the Nunavut community of Clyde River looking at a map of their area and discussing snow accumulation. Where the wind and the snowfall produce big deep drift, and where things blow bare, as an attempt to understand a bit more about wind and snow and so on the landscape. And but from an academic point of view, why should we be paying attention? Well, there are lots of reasons. A few: corroboration of findings. We may hear somebody's off of mute, I think. We may hear expansions of about a sighting of a bird that we think, oh, that's a range extension. It's the first time the bird's been seen there. Okay, I mean, how do we have confidence in that finding? Do we know that that's the case, or is it perhaps that the school teacher in a remote village, the new school teacher in a remote village, is a Audubon Society member who happens to sort of know where to report this, and it wasn't, this bird is not where it should be according to his bird book. Could be a new sighting, a new place for the bird. Or you could ask some of the locals and so on and see, if there's a native name for the bird, then that gives an idea that maybe it's not so new in the area. If people say, yeah, we have no idea what that is either, then it may give you a little more confidence that it really is a an extension of the range rather than just an extension of the reporting of the range. We could also get some interesting insights. My first real project involving Indigenous knowledge, I was interviewing a group of elders in the Western Alaska communities. We had Elam, Shaktulak, and Koyuk were working together, and 3 elders from each community were there and sitting around the table. We're having a conversation. And the project was on beluga whales. And the method was a semi-directed interview, which is, as it implies, sort of a little bit looser in form, not just a bunch of questions, but really starting a conversation and seeing where it goes and seeing what kind of connections people make. And started talking about beavers. And I thought, well, boy, they swim, they're mammals, but maybe we should get back to belugas. And one of the elders sort of saw me looking confused and said, well, do you know why we're talking about beavers? I said, well, no, not really. And he said, well, the thing is the beaver populations around here are increasing. They're damming up the streams around here. And those are the streams where the fish spawn that the belugas are eating down in the bay. And once he had explained this, of course, it all became crystal clear. But I don't think many of us, who were studying marine mammals would have thought that, hey, we really need to ask about beavers as well. But here are people who are spending lots of time on the ocean, inland, on the rivers, and so on, and seeing all of these connections and seeing things that may escape those of us who tend to focus more narrowly on a single species or a single domain. In another study in Canada, a couple of studies in Canada, can't remember which way the discrepancy went, but either the botanists were reporting that lichens were, going in one direction, increasing or decreasing, and Inuit knowledge was suggesting that the opposite was the case. And at first blush, you may think, oh boy, let's just sweep that one under the rug and pretend it never happened and not spend much more time on it, because we don't want to sort of say that somebody's wrong or that Inuit knowledge is missing the point or something. But in other ways, I think this becomes a really fascinating chance to dig deeper. And I'll give an example of that as well. I think that science is the fascinating parts in science come when we have findings that seem incompatible to us, and we have to find out why that's the case. And here the question is, what can we do to dig deeper into this? Is it a case of localized changes that the Inuit are noticing versus large-scale changes that the botanists are noticing? There's one group talking about biomass and another the number of species. There are a number of things that could be going on that are worthy of a closer look. And finally, few of us like being told what to do, and especially not when we think it's based on bad information. But this is what often happens in the world of natural resources management. As is often said, we typically manage humans. We don't manage the environment directly so much. And when we say, well, gee, you need to cut down on the hunting or the fishing because we're worried about the fish stock or the game population, that often doesn't go over too well, especially if people think that what they're seeing is the opposite of what that decision is being based on. And so, getting people involved in the research and in the decisions and so on that lead up to those type of management actions can really help, giving people a sense that they're at least being heard and that their information is being taken seriously. Doesn't mean it's any less enjoyable to have, say, the fishing limits reduced, but at least people can understand that there's a basis for it and feel like they've had a chance to be involved rather than just being told what to do. Again, drawing on Indigenous knowledge is one way to help show that we are taking people's experiences seriously and factoring that in and trying to incorporate different ways of looking at the world rather than just basing our decisions solely on one source of information. So, sounds great. I mean, all kinds of good reasons to do this. So, what's the problem? Why would anybody say no to this kind of thing? Well, there are lots of different sort of objections or cavils that I've heard over the years. We sometimes hear, well, it's anecdotal information, as if this is some kind of a slur that, as opposed to being, I suppose, nicely systematic and so on. Oh, sure. I mentioned that a lot of the information is transmitted by stories, um, and yet people are basing their own decisions on this, often staking their lives on the accuracy of the information, staking the well-being of their community on the idea that they can regularly find food and shelter and other things that they need in the environment. So it seems to me a pretty rigorous test. If people are still alive, practicing things based on traditional knowledge, that's a pretty good mark in favor of what traditional knowledge has to offer to us. There's a question of subjectivity. Um, I don't think this idea of objectivity in science is a fairly recent invention. It has a lot of power, to be sure. I don't mean to be running down science in any way, um, but the subjective nature of traditional knowledge is something we just have to realize. But it's also as I said, a case that this has been subjected to the test of survival for a long time. This also comes up with the idea that people are, going to sort of say things that will support their best interests. If they want to hunt more polar bears, they're not going to say, "Oh, there are fewer polar bears around." I mean, so the theory goes. My experience has been that the hunters are actually pretty scrupulous about reporting what they see and not making things up. Of course, there are always individuals who are going to do something different. For the most part, people are very careful about this, again, because lives depend on it. And you're not going to make up frivolous information that would put someone's life at risk that might come back and haunt you. Things get politicized. I think for a lot of scientists, that's sort of a scary place to get to, and we'd rather avoid it. When we start to talk about the management decisions, we're moving in that direction. If we then start to talk about Indigenous rights and sovereignty and politics, that can get pretty uncomfortable for a lot of scientists. Nonetheless, that's the world we're living in, and I think that's something too that we need to be aware of. We'll come back to that a little bit again towards the end. So to me, these are not things to turn us away from traditional knowledge, but things just to keep in mind as we're working in that field. Some of us, working in a cross-cultural setting is a huge plus and really interesting and terrific. For some people, again, that's kind of uncomfortable and scary territory, and they're not quite sure what to do. So I think, again, we have to be aware and have to do our preparation and our learning to know what we're getting into and to learn how to behave properly. We often hear it said that, to me, I've seen lots of different formulations of ethical rules or principles for how to do things, and a lot of it to me boils down to the golden rule, which is treat others the way you'd like to be treated. And in a cross-cultural setting, I'd make a little variation on that, which is treat other people the way they want to be treated. In a different culture, somebody may not want to be treated the way I would want to be treated. They may want to be treated a little bit differently, and it's important to pay attention to those kind of subtleties in a cross-cultural situation. We do hear the criticism that this is extractive, that someone like me is coming in, gathering a bunch of information, taking it out of the community and doing something with it elsewhere. That's certainly true. If I'm denying that, I'm kidding myself or kidding somebody else. To me, the question is, well, what's the purpose? What's the goal? If the goal is to, put a feather in my cap and show what a good researcher I am, then I'm kind of taking advantage of people. Certainly this has been beneficial to my career. I can't claim that this is all entirely selfless and so on, but there have to be other reasons too. And I think among those are giving voice to people who often aren't heard, giving some recognition to Indigenous knowledge in ways that it may not be recognized widely. I think that's something that has changed over the years, which is why it's great to see a course like this. I think 20, 25 years ago, that would have been pretty unlikely. Now we're seeing a lot more recognition of the value of Indigenous knowledge, and I think some of that has been a result of studies that have shown how much it has to offer, and that inevitably means taking it out of the community in some ways, but I think there are ways to do that respectfully as well. And then finally, I've heard somebody described it as sort of squishy. boy, it's sure nice when you can just deal with nice numbers and measurements. It's 23 degrees outside instead of, yeah, it's kind of chilly. Um, Again, I think that's something to keep in mind. It's often difficult to translate things directly into a nice hard number or feature. But I think that's often the case in many aspects of our lives too. Interpersonal relationships, we don't typically reduce those to numbers. We recognize there's a lot of ups and downs and pluses and minuses and so on. So if we're expecting Indigenous knowledge to fit neatly into a nice quantitative box that we can manipulate and do statistical analyses with, then that may be an unrealistic expectation. So enough of the theory. Let's talk about a few examples. I promised you some confirmation, some controversy, and some chaos. So a few confirmation examples. In southern Alaska, the black leather chiton pictured on the left, these are little intertidal creatures that cling to the rocks. They're about 2 or 3 inches long. They're a popular food for the Alutiiq communities in the region. And there'd been concerns in the early 2000s that the chitons, known locally as the bidarkie, that the bidarkies were declining, and they wanted to know why. And a graduate student named Ann Salomon came and did a bunch of work looking at the intertidal zone and using standard ecological things of measuring the densities of the bidarkies and the movements and the strength of the amount of wave energy that was pounding onto the beaches and the growth rates of the kelp that they eat, et cetera, et cetera. All of which are important. She also wound up working with local field assistants and so on, having some conversations with people about what was going on, and realized that there was a whole lot more that they had to offer in terms of telling the story. And so what we see on the graph there, the little timeline, is some time depth and context. So you can imagine Ann's study was just the far right-hand edge, from 2000 on. It gives you an interesting picture of what's going on. But talking to people gave us an idea of so much more, that we had this serial decline of things going on when the sea otters, which had been almost eradicated during the Russian fur era, eventually started coming back in the middle of the 20th century. Well, they're voracious predators, and not surprisingly, their favorite foods went away quickly. Once they had eaten the many sea urchins and sea cucumbers, they started to do a number on crab and shrimp, and then worked their way into clams and cockles, and eventually were coming around to eating the bidarkies. And Anne was able to show that beaches that had a high numbers of sea otters also had few bidarkies, kind of bearing this out. And they also added more of the human story of, you see the line of outboard motors there, of changes in society, of people's access to the area. In 1971, the communities got electricity, which meant that they could have freezers, which meant that if you harvested more than you could eat, you could put them in the freezer for later, rather than having no real incentive to harvest bidarkies that you couldn't eat. So this gave us a much richer and more wonderful story about what was going on in the ecosystem and with the societies in question. And this is a really neat project, and a great deal of credit to Anne for being open to this, and being willing to invest the time and effort to dig into a much deeper story than just the one that she was getting from her own field work on the beaches. Another one we did over the series of about 10 years, a couple of colleagues and I did interviews in a bunch of communities around the northern and western coasts of Alaska. This is a series of projects with a little bit of a different focus in terms of species, but as is often the case, you can't have a conversation about walrus that doesn't include other marine mammals and other features of the ecosystem and so on. So there was a lot in common in the studies and the interviews we had throughout the region too. And so this was great to be able to talk about the marine mammal patterns, where they were seen, what their behavior was, how they were interacting with say sea ice and the loss of sea ice, what was happening with seasonal patterns, with local patterns, et cetera, and how that was affecting the communities. And then to be able to make some local and regional comparisons. And so the map on the upper left is showing the details of what people in Shishmaref had to say about the marine mammals and their ecosystem. And the map on the right is our attempt at trying to capture some of the bigger trends going on statewide. And as you can see, shown in red are the sort of negative impacts on or things that are affecting communities negatively. The yellow ones are, maybe neutral or sort of 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. And in a few cases, some of the blue ones, that things are actually okay, or at least not getting too much worse. So it's interesting just to be able to put this together on a statewide pattern basis and see what the overall picture looks like. Another project is in the village of Savunga on St. Lawrence Island. That's me in the pink shirt, George Nunguk pointing to the map, and Chester Nunguk in the purple shirt on the other side of me. And we had a big project in the Bering Sea. This is a 5-year, multi-million-dollar project with hundreds of researchers. And I was working on the component involving 5 communities in the region. I went out to Savunga and we did some interviews about, in this case, local and traditional knowledge. That's what the funder like to call it. And interviewing people like George and Chester and learning about how they understand the abundance and distribution of the species around the island, and other features. And one of the interesting offshoots of this was that they talked about the way the winter winds affect sea ice in the Bering Sea. That if you have a persistent north winds during the winter, it pushes the sea ice a long way south. So on a map of sea ice distribution, it looks like there's a lot, and that's terrific. But it's all fairly thin, and so when spring comes, it tends to break up and melt pretty quickly and go away pretty quickly. That sounded like an interesting description of a broad pattern. At one of the meetings of all the researchers involved in this, a sea ice scientist named Jinlun Zhang showed a model of sea ice in the Bering Sea, the growth and retreat over the course of a few years. And it actually seemed to show exactly what the islanders were talking about. And so it was fascinating then to introduce George to Jinlun and have them talk about, one of them observing this via satellite, the other one observing it from, the beach in front of his home. But both of them seeing a similar pattern. And so we were able to look at that further and then dig into how that affects the people's ability to hunt walrus, which is a huge part of the subsistence round on St. Lawrence Island. So this gave us an insight and a chance to make connections and look deeper in a way that we wouldn't have been able to do if we didn't have both sources of information and a chance for people like George and Jinlun to get together. Controversy. I don't know if that's the right word, but confirmation, chaos, or controversy and chaos seem to have a nice ring to it. So I talked about the picture I showed earlier with the Inuit around the map talking about snow distribution. So a colleague of mine had done some work in Clyde River on Baffin Island about weather and wind and so on. And people had talked about changes in wind direction and changes in wind speed. And they'd said things like, the prevailing winter winds are changing in direction, and there's more variability in the winter winds. And that we're seeing stronger winds in winter, and again, more variability in wind speed. And she thought, well, this is cool. Let's look at the weather records and see what we can find. Maybe we can find evidence of this in the instrumental records. And what you see in red and yellow there are the fact that it really did not match up with the available weather records. Even the one that shows agreement, I put it in yellow because it was sort of agreement. It's not a strong agreement that I could have put in green and said, yeah, this really lines up. And so this really seems like we're describing very different things going on in this system. So, what's the story? And there are different things we can think about. I mean, the Inuit might be wrong. This corresponds to a period in which people switched from having dog teams to using snow machines. That gives you a very different experience of the weather as you're traveling the land, moving from seasonal camps into a fixed community and into a house with a furnace and so on, and gives you a different sort of sense of interaction with the weather. So there could be reasons that what the Inuit are describing just isn't quite right. But the available weather records were from the weather station at the local airstrip. Nobody goes hunting at the airport, so maybe that's not really representative of what you can see in the photo as a topographically diverse environment. So maybe what's happening at the weather station is not what's happening 100 miles inland or 50 miles to the north or south. Also, the weather station records really only went back to the late 70s. So maybe what people are comparing is, say, the 60s and 70s to the 80s and 90s. And we're only looking at the sort of the latter half of that period. It's also possible that we're comparing apples and oranges, that the weather station, what makes the little cups on an anemometer spin around is not quite the same as the way we experience wind, which may be affected by, say, the amount of blowing snow that is going around that's stinging your cheeks and making you think that, oh, today's a harsher wind than it was yesterday, even if the wind speed is exactly the same. So this has led now to, we started in 2009, so coming up on 14 years of further research digging into this in further ways. And again, the idea is that even when things don't align, or sometimes especially when things don't align, it gives us an opportunity for further studies that can be really fascinating and give us a lot more insight into what is going on. So we shouldn't shy away from situations where things don't line up. Again, there's often a tendency to sort of take a quick look at things and say, isn't it nice when Indigenous knowledge and scientific knowledge agree, and let's just highlight those things and move on. To me, it's also important to look at the places where that correspondence and alignment is not so obvious or doesn't seem to be there, and try to figure out what exactly is going on. So chaos. As with any human endeavor, the studies engaged with Indigenous knowledge are not going to be perfect and not going to work out great every time. Cook Inlet is the body of water that is near Anchorage. There's a population of beluga whales here that I think in the 80s was believed to be around 12 or 1,300 animals. Not sure anybody really has a great count, but it was believed to be a reasonably sized population. By the mid to late 90s, that had plummeted to about 350 animals. And so there was a lot of concern. It's a marine mammal. It was heading in the direction of becoming an endangered population. This is an area with Alaska's biggest human population. We have commercial fishing, there's offshore oil and gas operations, there's shipping, all kinds of things coming in, and the idea that we might have an endangered whale population here could really throw a wrinkle in a lot of things. So a lot of attention and concern to what was happening with the belugas. As I mentioned, the count was 300 or 350 animals or so. We heard from a few people from the area that, oh no, this wasn't right. There are 50,000 belugas in the Gulf of Alaska, the wider body of water that Cook Inlet opens into, and only a few hundred of them at any given time are coming into Cook Inlet. So, really, who cares how many are in Cook Inlet when there are so many whales out there that it's just not worth worrying about? And for a lot of people, this sounded like a wonderful explanation. No problem at all. There are tons of belugas. We can carry on, as Anchorage does, dumping barely treated sewage into Cook Inlet, dumping wastewater off the side of the oil rigs in a way that's not allowed anywhere else in the US. We could continue doing these kind of things. So, what's not to like about that story? Well, the question is there any real evidence for these 50,000 belugas? And I talked to people in Lower Cook Inlet. So the belugas that are the 300 that we count tend to be in Upper Cook Inlet. I talked to people in Lower Cook Inlet, where the belugas would have to go if they were going back and forth to the Gulf. Do you see belugas? Have you seen them around here? No, nobody really saw them. I talked to commercial fishermen operating out of Homer and Lower Cook Inlet who would then go out to the Gulf of Alaska and presumably would be in the same waters as these alleged 50,000 belugas. None of them remembered ever seeing a beluga in those waters. And so, we have to wonder, just because it was a few native folks from the area making these claims about 50,000 belugas, is that really traditional knowledge, or is this some kind of speculation or even fantasy? I have a couple ideas about what might motivate somebody to talk about 50,000 belugas that they've never seen, but that's sort of beside the point. We still have to, I think, as we're engaged in this type of work, to think about where the information is coming from, and to be willing to dig a little bit deeper at in cases like this, where nice as it would be to think of 50,000 belugas in the Gulf of Alaska, there just doesn't seem to be any evidence whatsoever to support that, other than a few people making some nice sounding claims. So where does this all take us? I'll give a few more thoughts, and then we'll have some time for discussion. Traditional knowledge, in my experience, is valuable. Like any human endeavor, it's not flawless. So let's always keep that in mind. But I've heard variations of that from native elders as well, of saying, hey, that I heard something new that I hadn't heard before. I'm going to keep an eye out and look for that myself. And it wasn't necessarily that they were doubting the person who said it. It's just that there's a difference between firsthand and secondhand information, and they wanted to be sure of something before they would pass it on as information that they stood behind as well. Showed that first slide of Warren Matumiak and Andy Mahoney talking. To me, it's really, really neat when you get a chance to see somebody who really knows their topic from different points of view, talking with each other. So to get the boreal ecologist talking with the people who spend a lot of time out in the northern forest and discussing forest fires and tree succession and everything else, and just realize that there's a hugely sophisticated conversation going on, and to watch people sort of learn that, hey, here's somebody that I can actually respect and who has a similar degree of knowledge to mine. A colleague of mine who's a snow scientist had been out on the land near Utqiagvik in northern Alaska with a local elder, and they dug a snow pit and looked at the different layers. And my friend has done this for his whole career and can sort of reconstruct the weather patterns of the whole winter by looking at the way the snow has accumulated and formed and deformed and so on. And he, as he was talking about this with the elder, he realized the elder could do exactly the same thing, looking at the same snow layers. And for my friend, it was like, wow, this is one of the few people in the world who can do this with me. And so it's really fun just hearing about those kinds of interactions where people get to really sort of build on and amplify one another's knowledge. With this in mind, I mean, I come at it more from the social sciences side, and I think that's helpful in many respects, in terms of methods, in terms of cross-cultural relations and so on. But at least in a lot of the work I do, and especially if with the E in your course title, traditional ecological knowledge, we're talking about things that are much more in the natural sciences realm. And that's why I think natural scientists have a big role here too. A lot to add to the conversation, a lot to gain from the conversation. And I think the trouble for someone like me is I could go out and dig a snow pit and look at it. I'm not going to know much of what I'm looking at as my colleague, the snow scientist. So, the local expert can tell me all about it, but I'm just not going to be capable of holding up my end of the conversation nearly as well as somebody who really understands that topic. So I think this is a case from the academic side of engaging people from different disciplines, each of whom has something to add to the work that we're doing together. And nothing works perfectly every time. Some studies work out, some studies don't. I think that's true in any endeavor here as well. So if the first study doesn't work out or something doesn't go right, okay, let's learn from it, but let's not abandon the whole idea and decide to never try it again. The little blurb I sent around the course also mentioned ethics. So you may be wondering, are we ever going to get to that? I don't consider myself an expert in all the aspects of ethics, but this, of course, is something that any of us has to think about as we're working in this field. And I think there are a few things to keep in mind. I mean, the basic principle of free, prior, and informed consent should be a minimum standard for anything that we're doing, engaging with people. What we see here is George Nongok, whom you saw earlier, and then his sister-in-law, Christina Aloha, in George's kitchen in Tabunga, and they're working actually on a project about St. Lawrence Island music. But a lot of fun working with both of them. But this idea of free, prior, and informed consent, people have to know what the study is about, what you're doing, what you're going to do with the information, and so on. They have to know that beforehand and agree to it beforehand. In addition to that, they have to have the right to withdraw and decide that they're no longer comfortable with what's going on. And of course, the consent has to be free, has to be freely given. We can't twist people's arm. All of which sounds pretty straightforward, but I think there's some, there can be some wrinkles here as well. I'll come back to that in a sec. As we're thinking about this, we also should be thinking about credit for the work. I'm documenting what people know, what people have learned from hard-won experience. In the academic world, my name is on the paper, usually as the first author. So, lots of credit to me. I didn't generate that information. It wasn't my neck on the line out on the land, year after year, day after day. And, to sort of pass it off as well, thanks to some people who shared this stuff with me, seems to be not really giving them due credit. Finding ways to credit people with authorship is useful, certainly worth considering. And then this respect for intellectual property. I heard a great talk by a lawyer once who was discussing this in the context of reindeer herding. As an academic, we may come in and say, "Oh, tell me about your reindeer husbandry techniques and what you do to keep the herd healthy and productive and so on." Well, in many ways, that's proprietary business information. You wouldn't have much luck if you walk into the headquarters of Coca-Cola and say, "Hey, I'm doing a study on things and I'd love to have your formula. Can you give it to me? Because this is for, it's for scholarly research. What's not to like?" Fat chance they're not going to share a thing with you. Why would we treat the reindeer herders any differently and expect them to give us their equivalent, their trade secrets, just because we happen to be curious? So that recognition and respect for intellectual property is very important. I mentioned earlier the idea of treating people the way they want to be treated. And I think certainly in many Indigenous communities, the sense of community and communal respect and knowledge is different than we find in mainstream American society. And so just, being able to go to an individual and say, "Hey, will you talk to me?" Okay, I mean, that can meet the standards of free, prior, and informed consent. But is that really culturally appropriate? If this is knowledge that's held communally or regarded as communal property, shouldn't we also be talking with, say, the tribal government or the equivalent to try to get wider community support or approval for what we're doing, rather than just finding a couple individuals who are willing to talk to us sort of behind everybody else's back, but thinking about the community that we're engaging in the way that they understand their knowledge, their intellectual property, and so on. And this can come up too in things of authorship. A lot of times people don't want to be singled out as the expert who deserves all the credit, but would rather be recognized as or have the recognition go to the broader community. These are important things to keep in mind. Finally, there are the pervasive and lingering effects of colonization and expectations and so on, and efforts we might make towards decolonization. This gets to that idea of the free consent. I don't think I appreciated it when I started, the power that I had coming into a community. I mean, I thought of myself, I'm a young researcher, just here working for a small organization, and of course the tribal government can say no to me. And I didn't realize, well, yeah, that may be true, but also, I mean, let's be blunt about it. I'm a white male, reasonably tall, well-educated, from by most global standards, an affluent background, and that I never had to worry about food on the table and things. I mean, that's a pretty powerful position, especially for people who have been subjected to colonization. It becomes can be very, very difficult for somebody to say no to someone who looks like me and comes from my background. And I have to keep that in mind too. If I'm coming in and saying, well, here I am, I want to do this study, does somebody really feel like they're in a position to say, I just don't want to do that, get lost? Or do they feel like, oh, geez, somebody's here, this is just the way things are. We have to do what we're told. And I think keeping in mind those historical influences and the degree of internalized colonization and so on is important. With that in mind, I remember one of the studies going and talking to somebody and saying, "Hey, I'd love to talk to you about what you know about beluga whales." And he said, "Oh, me? I don't know anything. I just hunt them, I eat them. What do I know?" Now, I mean, there's a benign explanation that, hey, you just never thought about how much is involved in being able to go out and hunt belugas successfully and come back safely. And in the course of an hour and a half, we covered a map with circles and arrows and notes and everything else, at the end of which he said, boy, I didn't know I had that much to say. And that may be just that he'd never really stepped back to think about it. The less benign explanation is that this is a product of having been told for generations that your knowledge isn't important. You don't have a big education. You're not that fluent in English. A whole bunch of things that kind of discredit you and discount you. And if people have internalized that, then what happens when somebody like me with a Ph.D. shows up and says, hey, what do you know? This guy may say, compared to you, not much. I know that's not the case, but if he's internalized that side of colonization, then that may be something that we have to keep in mind and work with. So again, a lot of things to keep thinking about in the ethical side of how we engage with this. None of it meant to discourage anybody from doing it, but just that we should be aware of these as we're going in and try to understand some of the history and some of the trends in the field. And I'm sure I hope that in another 10 or 20 years, people will look back on some of the stuff we're doing today and say, hey, that was a nice step, but we've come so much further than that. So, little wrap up. A few things. I mean, it's interesting. A guy named Peter Katuk from Sanikiluaq in Hudson Bay talked about catching a bunch of seals and finding shrimp instead of fish in their stomachs, and the way that the seals would partially sink in the water. I connected him with an oceanographer who was fascinated to learn about these kind of connections. So how do we do a better job of connecting the Peter Katuks of the world with others who are interested in finding out? And Peter was very curious. He wanted to know too what was going on. What were the broader trends going on that led to the changes he was seeing? So there's learning on both sides, and we just need to find ways to make that connection. Traditional knowledge, for many of the holders and many of the Indigenous advocates of more work on traditional knowledge, is a stepping stone. It's not that the goal is to have the kind of academic papers that I often write. The goal is to have a bigger say in management. Co-management, hunters and managers working together is one step in that direction, which is good. And I think a lot more can be done in that direction too. And then this idea that, what are we talking? In some cases, I've heard people talk about, my knowledge and your knowledge, and making a distinction versus working towards a collective sense of our knowledge. We're working together on this. Together, we're doing things that none of us can do separately. And then the more we can learn, the more we can pool our knowledge in a respectful way, and give a chance for everybody to have a say and for everybody to learn. It's a net gain for everybody. So that may be an ideal to be striving towards, and to find the places where that can happen. So thank you. I think that was a little longer than I thought, but there's a little bit of time for conversation. So Ty and Roll, thank you very much for this, and happy to answer questions or start a discussion. And I'll end the sharing too.
Excellent. Thank you, Henry. There's Bill Fox has his hand up, and we have 2 questions posted. But again, we'll give Henry a virtual round of applause here, and then open it up for any questions. So, excellent job, Henry. Thank you. Bill, you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Lopez. Henry, thank you very much. Quick question, just, we're thinking about how can we capture some of these experiences and things, but taking a step back, what kind of advice would you give to Western scientists as they begin to engage with the traditional ecological knowledge and engage with those indigenous communities? First steps, I mean, how do you step into that realm and begin that relationship?
Great question. I think that to me, the first thing is sort of the attitude that we bring. Are we ready? Are we going to be open to the conversation, and are we willing to come in and to share? What I hear again and again from Indigenous communities is, we're looking, what we want to see is a relationship. And so are we ready to have that relationship? This doesn't mean that you now have to commit to working in that community for the rest of your career, but are you willing to work with people as people, and not to have it be a sort of transactional thing of, hey, I've got some money to pay for this, and in exchange I want 6 people around a table to tell me things for the next few days. So think about the attitude and what we can bring to a relationship. Then I think do a bit of homework about the community and the culture and so on, and also what research has been done there. What we often hear is, there's a concept of research fatigue, that people are tired of hearing researchers coming in. I think it's a little more nuanced. I think what people are really tired of is me coming in and asking the same questions that you asked a week ago. Whereas if I've paid attention and said, hey, Bill was here last week or last year and talked about these things, I'd love to dig deeper into some of that. Then we're being a bit more respectful of people's time and kind of enhancing that conversation. And then, as I said, not everything is going to work fine. There's always going to be somebody who wants you to get lost, but in other ways, just create the opportunities to start the conversation and see where it goes.
Thank you.
I'm looking at the written questions. One from Sarah Ann about language barriers. What helped you recognize that you were using the same words but had different meanings, and how do you close that gap? Great question, and I think we have to, especially with a language barrier, we have to be aware of what people know and what they don't know. I was actually on a jury once in northern Alaska, and it really hinged on, it appeared that the defendant had fully confessed to the crime, and yet it was also clear that his English was pretty minimal, and so it wasn't clear to us on the jury that it really meant, that what he meant was what he said, or that what he said was what he really meant. This may have been the only sort of crude and clumsy way he had of expressing himself. If they'd had an interpreter, that probably would have solved the question. We would have had some more confidence in what he had said. I think again, a crucial thing here is to come in with some humility that there are going to be misunderstandings, going to be things that we don't get, and we have to be careful not to make assumptions and think that just because somebody said something that seems clear to us, that we understood it. And always sort of be checking yourself or making sure that, gee, I think I heard you say this. Is that really what you meant? Again, sort of building up a relationship. And this can get obnoxious. You don't want to be questioning every single statement. Hey, you said the sky was blue. Do you really mean blue? And, it's kind of tedious. But you may have stories where people say, well, the belugas swim up the river and then turn into wolves and then run across the land. Okay. To me, that doesn't quite make sense. To them, that's part of their understanding of how the ecosystem works. So, let's have some respect for the way they see the world, and try to reflect that and so on, at least to have that as our starting point. This came up in a paper where again, George Nunguk, whose picture you saw a couple times, was talking about a behavior of bowhead whales swimming up along one side of the boat to assess whether the crew is worthy of the whale giving itself as a gift to the whalers. And they'd swim up on the left side of the boat, and then if the crew was worthy, they'd swim over to the right side where they could be harpooned. And one of the reviewers said, well, I doubt whales have that cognitive ability, and in any case, just get a left-handed harpooner. And I gave George the idea of the left-handed harpooner, and he just laughed and said, well, in that case, if you had a left-handed harpooner, the whale would come up on the right side first and away from the harpooner. To me, it's less relevant to start with whether this is, whale behavior that we can think is a reasonable portrayal of whale brains and things, and more to the point that this is how the whalers understand their relationship with the whale. And if we don't understand their perspective on the relationship with the whale, we're not going to get very far when it talks about the right ways to interact with whales and what that means for management and so on. So I hope that's at least a partial answer to the question. And then Toby has a question: how can we better build natural sciences collaboration, given that so much of natural science work is driven by quantitative metrics? How do we bridge the gap between TEK generally being qualitative and academic science being quantitative? Great question. And of course, the qualitative-quantitative divide is not just between Indigenous knowledge and much of academic research, but in many different fields in academia. Books have been written about history and philosophy of science, and is observational studies as much science as nice hypothesis-driven laboratory studies with controls and measurements and everything else. Fascinating question. Not really one that keeps me awake at night. More a question of how do we make the connections between what people are seeing. So I mentioned that wind project. So Inuit have a number of different terms for wind speed and so on. And we can often think of these as qualitative. They can be described as the amount of blowing snow. Is the snow sort of blowing up so it gets knee high? Is it coming up so it's higher up on your body? Is it swirling so it's way up above your head? All of which sound qualitative. All of which are reminiscent of the Beaufort scale. If you're used to that, there's a force 12 winds or force 6 winds, many of which have to do with how a flag is waving in the wind or whether they're white capped on the water. So I think there are ways to make connections across the qualitative descriptions and quantitative ones. And I think the recognition that quantitative things are great in many respects, and in other ways not so great. And there are qualitative things that qualitative studies and insights have to offer that the quantitative ones don't, and vice versa. I know we're running out of time, but let's see one more. There's only a few, sometimes just one person willing to share knowledge. I haven't really come across that, but I've come across the case where people, there's maybe one or two people who decide whether they're, the things have to go through them. I think that's you need to decide on a case-by-case basis of, what position they have in the community, what community respect they have, and so on. Again, not an excuse to go around and dismiss somebody, but just to make sure that, in some cases it's the local loudmouth, in some cases it's the tribal chief, and really nothing is going to happen without him or her. And I think, just again, kind of understanding how the local community works is an important part of it.
A great presentation. The two things that kind of struck me, Henry, is the first, when you think about the scientific method, and I was interested or excited about your presentation as an academic, and really the first step in that method is making observations, and I think the advantage of TEK is the fact that you just have a long time to make these observations and being able to draw from those, right? That's obvious, but yet a good reminder. And then the other thing that you said that kind of struck me, which I think is important, is, you know, as an outsider, we may we need to be sensitive in how we may be viewed. We may be in a position of power, right, or influence, and we may not be aware of that just because of our upbringing or background. And I think that's a good reminder, and has applications in a lot of places.
Well, thanks. A real pleasure to be able to speak. And again, I'm just delighted that you and Ty are offering this course, and to so many people for signing up. So thank you for the chance to speak.